Marcus Thompson stared at the formal letter on his desk, his coffee growing cold beside it. The morning sun streamed through his Atlanta office window, casting a warm glow on the gold-sealed document that would change his life. At 52 years old, with graying hair at his temples and wisdom lines around his eyes, he had just been offered the position of police chief in Millbrook, a small town 3 hours away. His fingers traced over the words, "Pleased to offer you the position," but his mind kept drifting back to the incident that had happened there 2 weeks ago. The memory made his wrists ache where the zip ties had cut into his skin. He unconsciously rubbed them, feeling the phantom pressure of plastic restraints. On his office walls hung numerous awards and certificates from his 25 years in law enforcement. Distinguished Service Medals, Community Leadership Awards, and his master's degree in criminal justice reform all testified to his dedication. But none of those credentials had mattered that night in Millbrook when 3 officers had seen nothing but his skin color. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the busy Atlanta streets below. He thought about his journey, from a beat cop walking the toughest neighborhoods to becoming one of the most respected reform advocates in Georgia law enforcement. His work on rebuilding trust between police and minority communities had caught the attention of Millbrook's selection committee. "What they don't know," he muttered to himself, "is that I've already met some of their officers in the worst possible way." He picked up his phone and looked at the video again. Someone had sent it to him anonymously. Shaky footage showing 3 Millbrook police officers zip-tying a black man to a pole. The video didn't show his face clearly, and in his casual clothes, jeans and a sweater, he looked nothing like the decorated police captain he was. He had been helping a stranded motorist when the officers arrived, immediately aggressive and accusatory. His secretary, Janet, knocked on the door and entered with more coffee. "Still thinking about the offer, sir?" she asked, noticing the letter on his desk. "You know what's funny, Janet? They chose me because of my record in community policing and reform work." The selection committee talked for hours about wanting to change their department's culture. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. They have no idea how much their department needs it. Janet had worked with him for 15 years. She knew about the incident. She'd been the first person he called after it happened. "Are you going to report those officers before you take the position?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "No, I've been thinking about this all week. If I report them now, it becomes a media circus. There'll be defensiveness, denial, and no real change." He walked back to his desk and picked up the letter. "But if I accept this position, you'll be their boss," Janet finished, understanding dawning on her face. "Exactly. And instead of just punishing 3 officers, I'll have the chance to change an entire department." His voice grew stronger as he spoke. "This isn't just about those 3. It's about the culture that made them think it was okay to treat anyone that way." He sat down and pulled out his fountain pen, a gift from his father when he first joined the police force. "You know what my dad told me when he gave me this pen, Janet?" He said, "Son, sometimes you have to sign up for the hard fights." With steady hands, Marcus signed the acceptance letter. He would have 6 weeks to prepare before taking command in Millbrook. 6 weeks to plan how to transform a department that didn't yet know how badly it needed transforming. "Should I send the acceptance letter right away?" Janet asked, reaching for the signed document. "Yes," Marcus replied, standing up and putting on his suit jacket. "And Janet? Let's start gathering data on Millbrook's police department. Arrest statistics, civilian complaints, everything from the last 5 years. Those 3 officers showed me exactly what's wrong. Now I need to understand how deep the problems go." As Janet left his office, Marcus looked once more at his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him wasn't angry or seeking revenge. Instead, he saw determination in his eyes. In his 25 years of service, this would be his biggest challenge, and possibly his greatest opportunity to create real change. "Time to get to work," he said to himself, and began clearing his desk for the task ahead. 2 weeks before receiving his job offer, Marcus Thompson had driven to Millbrook on a quiet Sunday evening. He wanted to get a real feel for the town he might soon serve. The streets were mostly empty, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. He was wearing his most comfortable clothes, worn jeans, a navy blue sweater, and his old brown leather jacket. His police badge and ID stayed in his car's glove compartment. Tonight, he wasn't Captain Thompson from Atlanta. He was just another traveler passing through. Around 8:30 p.m., he spotted an elderly white woman standing beside her broken-down car near Mason Street. Her hazard lights blinked weakly in the growing darkness. Marcus pulled over, remembering how his mother had taught him to always help others in need. "Having car trouble, ma'am?" he asked, keeping his distance to not frighten her. The woman, who introduced herself as Martha Collins, looked relieved. "Oh, thank goodness. My car just stopped, and I can't get any cell service here." Marcus was checking under her car's hood when he heard the sound of police sirens. 3 Millbrook police cars surrounded them, the bright lights flooding the area. 6 officers stepped out, but only 3 approached, all white men in their 30s. "Step away from the vehicle," the tallest officer ordered, his hand resting on his gun. Marcus raised his hands slowly, staying calm. "Good evening, officers. I'm just helping this lady with her car trouble." "Shut up and put your hands behind your back," another officer snapped, already pulling out his zip ties. Martha tried to explain. "No, you don't understand. This kind man was helping me." "Ma'am, please step back," the third officer cut her off. "We'll handle this." Within moments, they had Marcus's hands tied behind his back. Despite his calm explanations, they weren't listening. They dragged him to a nearby light pole, securing him to it with more zip ties. "Looks like we caught ourselves a car thief," the tall officer laughed, high-fiving his partner. "I'm not a thief," Marcus said firmly. "I'm a police captain from Atlanta. My ID is in my car." One officer snorted. "Yeah, right. And I'm the President of the United States." They started taking selfies next to him, laughing and making jokes. Marcus stayed silent, memorizing their badge numbers and faces. In his 25 years of police work, he had never felt so humiliated, yet he knew losing his temper would only make things worse. Martha was crying now, still trying to tell the officers they were making a mistake. The other 3 officers stood by their cars, watching but doing nothing to stop their colleagues. Then came the moment that changed everything. A young black woman named Shanice Williams walked by, saw what was happening, and bravely started recording with her phone. "What's going on here?" she demanded loudly. "Why is this man tied to a pole?" The officers' attitudes changed instantly when they saw the phone. The tall one stepped forward. "This is police business. Move along." But Shanice stood her ground. "I'm live streaming this right now. The whole world can see what you're doing." She wasn't actually live streaming, but her bluff worked. The officers quickly cut Marcus free, suddenly all business and no more laughter. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," one officer mumbled, not meeting Marcus's eyes. "May I get my ID now?" Marcus asked calmly. When no one stopped him, he walked to his car and retrieved his badge and police ID. The officers' faces turned pale when they saw his credentials. The tall one started stammering an apology, but Marcus just held up his hand. "Badge numbers 2257, 2301, and 2290. Today is October 12th, approximately 8:45 p.m. I'll be remembering those details." His voice was quiet but firm. As the officers scrambled back to their cars and sped away, Shanice approached Marcus. "Are you okay, sir? I have everything on video if you need it." Marcus gave her his email address, thanked her for her courage, and helped Martha call a tow truck before leaving. On his drive back to Atlanta that night, he wasn't angry. Instead, his mind was already forming plans. Sometimes, he thought to himself, the best way to fight injustice is from the inside. Little did those officers know, they had just zip-tied their future boss to a pole and given him all the evidence he needed to transform their department forever. The week after the incident, Marcus Thompson sat in his favorite leather armchair at home, surrounded by family photos and the gentle ticking of his grandfather's old clock. His wife Sarah, a high school principal, sat across from him on their living room couch, watching his face as he replayed the video of his humiliation for the 20th time. "You've been watching that video every night," Sarah said softly. "What are you really thinking about, Marcus?" Marcus put his phone down and rubbed his tired eyes. The job offer from Millbrook sat on the coffee table between them, next to a cup of Sarah's homemade hot chocolate. Their teenage daughter Maya's voice drifted down from upstairs as she talked on the phone with her friends, reminding them both how decisions like this would affect their whole family. "I could file a complaint right now," Marcus said, picking up his mug. Those officers would probably lose their jobs. The media would love it. Respected black police captain racially profiled and zip-tied to a pole. It would make national news. Sarah nodded. But that's not what you want to do, is it? Marcus stood up and walked to their family photo wall. He stopped in front of a picture of his father in his old police uniform from the 1970s. Dad used to tell me stories about being one of the first black officers in his department. He didn't just fight the criminals. He had to fight the racism in his own police station. And now history is repeating itself, Sarah said, joining him by the wall. Not exactly. Marcus turned to his wife. Dad had to fight from the bottom. I have a chance to fight from the top. He picked up the job offer. If I take this position, I won't just be punishing 3 racist officers. I'll have the power to change an entire department's culture. Maya came downstairs for a glass of water, stopping when she saw her parents looking serious. Are you guys still talking about moving to Millbrook? Marcus beckoned his daughter over. Come here, baby girl. What do you think about all this? Maya, wise beyond her 16 years, thought for a moment. Those officers were wrong, Dad, but you always tell me that when someone does something wrong, we should try to teach them to do better, not just punish them. Sarah smiled proudly at their daughter. Out of the mouths of babes. Marcus sat down with his family, spreading out papers on the coffee table, research he'd done on Millbrook's police department. Look at these numbers. In the past 5 years, black drivers were 6 times more likely to be stopped than white drivers. Excessive force complaints are through the roof. Those 3 officers didn't come from nowhere. They're a symptom of a bigger problem. And you think you can fix it? Maya asked. Not alone, Marcus replied. But as chief, I can start the process. New training programs, community outreach, accountability measures. Those officers thought it was funny to zip tie an innocent black man to a pole. They need to learn why it wasn't funny at all. Sarah took his hand. It won't be easy. Some officers will resist change. I know, Marcus nodded. But think about this. Those same officers who humiliated me will soon be sitting in my office, not knowing I was the man they tied up. That's not just irony. It's an opportunity. They'll either learn and change, or they'll find another line of work. Maya hugged her father. I think you should do it, Dad. Show them what good policing looks like. Marcus looked at his wife, who smiled and nodded. He picked up his pen and the job acceptance letter. Then it's decided. But we do this as a family. Maya, we'll make sure you finish this school year in Atlanta before we move. Sarah, I know you'll have to find a new position. We're with you, Sarah assured him. Besides, Millbrook schools could probably use some work on their diversity policies too. As Marcus signed the acceptance letter, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The decision wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about transformation. Those officers had no idea that their act of cruelty would lead to the biggest change their department had ever seen. Time to make your grandfather proud, Sarah said, pointing to the old clock that had been his father's. Marcus smiled, sealing the envelope. Time to make everyone proud. The morning of Marcus Thompson's first day as Millbrook's police chief dawned bright and clear. He stood before the mirror in his new office, adjusting his crisp uniform and checking that his chief's badge was perfectly straight. The department's main conference room down the hall was filling up with officers for the morning briefing, his first meeting as their leader. At exactly 8:00 a.m., Marcus walked into the packed room. 60 pairs of eyes watched him, some curious, some suspicious, some hopeful. In the front row, he immediately spotted them, Officers Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks, the 3 men who had tied him to that pole 6 weeks ago. They sat there looking confident, completely unaware of who he really was. Good morning, everyone, Marcus said, his voice strong and clear. I'm Chief Marcus Thompson. He watched as the 3 officers smiled and nodded, not a hint of recognition in their eyes. His civilian clothes and the darkness of that night had hidden his identity well. Marcus moved to the front of the room and picked up a remote control. Before we talk about the future of this department, I want to show you something from my recent visit to Millbrook. The screen behind him came to life. The 3 officers' smiles froze as the video began playing, showing them surrounding Marcus that night, ignoring his explanations, zip-tying him to the pole, taking selfies, and laughing. The room fell dead silent. Officers Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks sank lower in their chairs, their faces turning pale as they realized the horrible truth. Other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking down, others glancing nervously between their new chief and their disgraced colleagues. Marcus paused the video. That man they tied to a pole, the one they mocked and humiliated. That was me, 6 weeks ago, while I was here evaluating your community. Officer Jenkins started to stand, probably to offer an excuse, but Marcus held up his hand. Stay seated, officer. We're not finished. Walking slowly around the room, Marcus continued. I could have reported this incident immediately. Those 3 officers would have been fired, and this department would have faced national shame, but that wouldn't solve the real problem, would it? He turned to face the entire room. The real problem isn't just 3 officers who made a terrible choice. The real problem is a culture that made them think their actions were acceptable. A culture where other officers stood by and watched. A culture that needs to change. Marcus clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about the department's history of racial profiling and excessive force complaints. These numbers tell a story of systemic bias, but today, we begin writing a new story. He looked directly at Officers Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks, who couldn't meet his eyes. Those 3 empty chairs in my office, they're waiting for you after this meeting. We're going to have a very interesting conversation about your futures in law enforcement. Then he addressed the entire room again. For everyone else, understand this, I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for reform. Starting today, this department will undergo comprehensive retraining in de-escalation, implicit bias, and community policing. Every officer will be held to the highest standards of conduct. Marcus clicked to a final slide showing his plans for department reform. Change isn't comfortable. Some of you won't like it. Some of you might choose to leave. But those who stay will be part of transforming this department into something this community can truly trust and be proud of. The room remained silent, but he could see different reactions on different faces: shame, surprise, thoughtfulness, and even hope. Dismissed, Marcus said firmly, Officers Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks, my office, now. As the room emptied, Marcus caught fragments of whispered conversations. Did you see their faces? Man, they're done for. Maybe this change thing isn't so bad. Marcus watched the 3 officers trudge toward his office, their shoulders slumped. In a few minutes, he would offer them a choice that would surprise everyone, a chance at redemption that none of them expected. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to destroy an enemy is to turn them into an ally. His father had taught him that, and now he would put that lesson to its greatest test. Officers Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks sat in Marcus Thompson's office like 3 schoolboys sent to the principal. The morning sun streamed through the windows, making the badges on their uniforms shine. Badges they were probably about to lose. Jenkins, the tallest of the 3, and the one who had laughed the loudest that night, kept wiping sweat from his forehead. Miller stared at the floor, while Brooks nervously played with his wedding ring. Marcus sat behind his desk, letting the silence fill the room. On his desk lay 3 resignation forms, already dated and ready for signatures. Next to them was the video from that night, playing on his laptop with the sound muted. Finally, Marcus spoke. Officer Jenkins, do you remember what you said when you took that selfie next to me? Jenkins swallowed hard. Sir, I want to apologize. That wasn't my question. Marcus cut him off calmly. You said, this is going on my wall of fame. Tell me, did you hang that picture up? No, sir, Jenkins whispered, his face red with shame. Marcus turned to Miller. And you, Officer Miller? You were the one who suggested using 2 zip ties because, and I quote, this one looks like he might be trouble. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. What made you think I looked like trouble? Miller couldn't answer, but they all knew why. His skin color had been enough to make him trouble in their eyes. Brooks, the youngest of the 3, suddenly burst out, Chief, we know we messed up. We're ready to hand in our badges. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying them. Are you? Is that really the best outcome here? 3 fired officers, 3 ruined careers, and nothing really changes except you take your prejudices somewhere else? The officers looked up, confused. This wasn't the angry confrontation they had expected. Marcus stood and walked to his office window, looking out at the Millbrook streets. I have a different proposal. one that's going to be much harder than just walking away. He turned back to face them. Here's your choice. Behind door number 1, you sign these resignation papers and leave law enforcement forever. Simple, clean, done. He gestured to the forms on his desk. And door number 2? Jenkins asked quietly. Door number 2 is the hard path. You keep your badges, but you earn them back the right way. Marcus started counting off on his fingers. First, you'll each spend 1 month working with the community you've hurt. I'm talking about volunteering at the Black Community Center, attending church services, really getting to know the people you've been profiling. He continued, second, you'll go through extensive retraining, not just the usual sensitivity courses, but real, intensive work on understanding systemic racism and your own biases. You'll meet with families who've been victims of police misconduct. You'll learn their stories. The officers exchanged glances as Marcus went on. Third, you'll become part of the solution. Once you've completed your retraining, you'll help teach other officers. Your story, our story, will become a lesson in what not to do and how to do better. And if we choose this option, Miller asked, then you'll be under a microscope. One slip-up, one sign of the old attitudes, and you're done. No third chances. Marcus sat back down. But if you succeed, you'll help change not just yourselves, but this entire department. Brooks spoke up, his voice shaky. Why would you give us this chance, after what we did to you? Marcus smiled slightly, because 25 years ago, another black officer gave me a chance when I made a mistake. He could have ended my career. Instead, he taught me to be better. He pointed to a photo on his wall of an older black officer. That man changed my life. Now, I'm offering you the same opportunity. The room fell quiet again. Marcus pushed both the resignation forms and 3 new documents, training commitment papers, toward them. The choice is yours, gentlemen. Resign now, or take the harder path and become part of real change. Jenkins reached for a paper first, then Miller, then Brooks. Their hands were shaking, but none of them reached for the resignation forms. Sometimes, Marcus thought, watching them sign the training commitments, the biggest changes start with the most unlikely people. 3 months into Chief Thompson's leadership, the Millbrook Police Department looked very different. The old break room, once filled with stale coffee and tired officers avoiding the public, had been transformed into a community meeting space. Today, Officers Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks stood there, facing a group of local black residents, their uniforms replaced by casual clothes. My name is Officer James Jenkins, the tall officer said, his voice carrying none of its old arrogance. 3 months ago, I helped zip tie an innocent man to a pole because of the color of his skin. That man turned out to be our new chief, but it shouldn't have mattered who he was. What we did was wrong, period. The room was packed with community members, some nodding, others watching with crossed arms and skeptical eyes. Among them sat Martha Collins, the elderly woman from the night of the incident, and Shanice Williams, who had recorded the video. Chief Thompson stood quietly at the back, watching his reform program in action. Officer Miller stepped forward next. For 10 years, I thought I was a good cop because I followed procedures. But I never questioned those procedures, never asked why we stopped more black drivers than white ones, never wondered why we patrolled certain neighborhoods more than others. As part of their rehabilitation, each officer had spent the past weeks working in the black community. Jenkins had helped at the local youth center, Miller had volunteered at the elderly care program, and Brooks had assisted at the community food bank. Their faces were now familiar to many in the room. Officer Brooks shared his experience. Last week, I played basketball with kids at the community center. One boy asked me why cops always looked scary. That hit me hard. We're supposed to make people feel safe, not frightened. Chief Thompson moved to the front of the room. These officers chose the hard path of change, but they're not alone. He clicked a remote, showing statistics on the wall screen. Civilian complaints down 40% in 3 months. Traffic stops now showing equal treatment across races. Response times improved in all neighborhoods. Community engagement hours up 200%. Change doesn't happen overnight, Marcus continued, but it happens person by person, choice by choice. He outlined the department's new programs. Mandatory weekly community service for all officers. Body cameras with public review process. Regular town halls with residents. de-escalation training led by community members, ride-along programs for citizens, youth mentorship initiatives. An elderly black man raised his hand. This all sounds good, Chief, but how do we know it'll last? Marcus gestured to a table covered with documents. These are our new department policies, written with community input. They're legally binding, but more importantly, he pointed to Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks. These officers are our strongest evidence. They're not just following new rules, they're helping write them. The three officers then shared their experiences from the intensive retraining program. Meetings with families affected by police misconduct. Cultural sensitivity workshops led by community leaders. Implicit bias training with professional counselors. Conflict resolution classes taught by peace activists. Jenkins spoke about his most powerful moment. I sat with Mrs. Johnson, whose son was wrongly arrested last year. She cried telling the story. For the first time, I saw it through a mother's eyes. Miller described his change. I used to think following procedures meant being a good officer. Now I understand that good policing means being part of the community, not just policing it. Brooks added, "We're not asking for forgiveness. We're asking for a chance to show that people can change, and that this department can change." As the meeting ended, community members approached the officers, some sharing stories, others asking questions. The invisible wall between police and community was slowly crumbling. Chief Thompson watched with satisfaction. His risky decision to rehabilitate rather than fire the officers was paying off. They had become powerful symbols of change, their transformation more convincing than any policy document. Later that evening, as he prepared to leave, he saw Jenkins helping an elderly black woman to her car, Miller laughing with some teenagers outside, and Brooks discussing community programs with local leaders. Sometimes, he thought, the worst mistakes lead to the best changes. He picked up a new application from his desk. Other departments were now asking to learn about Millbrook's reform program. The change was spreading, one department at a time. 1 year after Chief Marcus Thompson's arrival in Millbrook, the local community center buzzed with excitement. The large meeting hall was filled with people from all parts of town. Black families sat next to white neighbors, elderly residents chatted with teenagers, and police officers in casual clothes mingled freely with community members. At the front of the room, Shanice Williams, the young woman who had recorded the infamous video a year ago, stood at a podium. She was now the head of the new Police Community Oversight Committee. Next to her stood officers Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks, looking very different from the arrogant men they had been 12 months earlier. "A year ago," Shanice began, "I saw these three officers tie a man to a pole. Today, I work with them to make our community better. That's not just change, that's transformation." The crowd applauded as she showed slides of the year's achievements. Civilian complaints dropped by 60%. 0 incidents of excessive force in the past 6 months. Community trust rating up from 30% to 85%. Crime rate down by 25%. Response times improved in all neighborhoods equally. In the back of the room, Chief Thompson watched proudly. His wife Sarah, now a respected vice principal at Millbrook High School, squeezed his hand. Their daughter Maya, who had made friends with both police officers' kids and community members' children, sat with a mixed group of teenagers who helped run youth programs. Officer Jenkins stepped up to speak next. He looked more relaxed, more human in his casual clothes. "Last year, I thought being a good cop meant showing power. Now I know it means showing respect." He gestured to a group of young black men he coached in basketball twice a week. "These guys taught me more than any police manual ever did." Officer Miller shared his story next. He had transformed the department's training program, replacing old aggressive tactics with community-based approaches. "We used to train officers to control situations. Now we train them to understand situations." Officer Brooks, who had become a favorite at local schools, talked about the new youth mentorship program. Kids who used to run from police now want to become officers themselves. That's real change. The changes weren't just in police behavior. Community members stood up to share their experiences. Mrs. Johnson, who had once feared police, described calling officers to help with her teenage son's crisis. They came without sirens, talked to him calmly, and got him the help he needed. No handcuffs, no shouting, just human kindness. Mr. Rodriguez, a local shop owner, talked about how officers now regularly visited his store just to chat. They know our names, ask about our families. They're part of our community now. Reverend Jackson from the local black church shared how officers attended services and community events. They're not just faces behind badges anymore. They're our neighbors, our friends. Chief Thompson finally took the podium. A year ago, I was tied to a pole on Mason Street. Today, that street has a new community police center where officers and residents meet daily. He paused, looking at his former tormentors, now his most dedicated reformers. But the real change isn't in buildings or programs. It's in hearts and minds. He revealed the department's newest initiatives. A scholarship program for minority youth interested in law enforcement. Monthly community dinners hosted by officers. Joint police community sports leagues. Regular cultural celebration events. A citizen advisory board for all major police decisions. The biggest surprise came when Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks announced they were starting a training program to help other departments learn from Millbrook's transformation. They would share their story, not just the mistake, but the journey to make it right. As the meeting ended, people didn't rush to leave. Officers chatted with residents, made plans for community events, and exchanged phone numbers with citizens. Children played safely while their parents talked, no longer worried about tension between police and community. Outside, Chief Thompson watched as Officer Jenkins helped an elderly black man to his car, while Officer Miller played basketball with some teens, and Officer Brooks discussed plans for the next community event with local mothers. Sarah came up beside him. "You did it, Marcus." He shook his head, smiling. "No, we did it. All of us together." Looking at his transformed department and community, Marcus remembered his father's words about making change from the inside. Millbrook had become living proof that change was possible, one relationship at a time. 2 years after the zip tie incident, Chief Marcus Thompson stood in front of a much larger audience. The National Police Reform Conference in Washington, D.C. had invited him to give the keynote speech. In the audience sat police chiefs from across the country, government officials, and most importantly, his 3 reformed officers, Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks, who now traveled the country teaching other departments about change. Marcus clicked to the first slide, showing the infamous photo of him tied to the pole. A murmur ran through the crowd. This photo could have ended 3 careers and sparked another news cycle of anger. He began. Instead, it started a revolution in policing that's spreading across America. The next slides showed Millbrook's remarkable 2-year results. Civilian complaints down 85%. 0 racial profiling incidents in 18 months. Crime rate reduced by 40%. Officer satisfaction up 90%. Community trust at 95%. Other departments adopting their model. In the audience, Officer Jenkins sat straight and proud. Last month, he had been promoted to lead the department's new Community Relations Division. Officer Miller now ran the Reform Training Program, teaching new officers how to serve with respect instead of fear. Officer Brooks had become the department's youth outreach coordinator, turning former trouble spots into community gathering places. The Millbrook model, as people called it, had spread to 30 other police departments across the country. The 3 officers who once took shameful selfies now taught other departments how to change, their story more powerful because they had lived it. Marcus showed videos from Millbrook today. Officers playing basketball with local kids. Community members attending police training sessions. Joint police community cleanup projects. Minority recruitment numbers at record highs. Former critics serving on police advisory boards. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Marcus continued. Real change happens in small moments. He shared recent stories. A black teenager calling his former worst enemy Officer Jenkins for advice. Officer Miller's daughter dating the son of a community activist. Officer Brooks coaching a youth baseball team with kids who once feared police. The spot where Marcus was tied up, now transformed into a community garden. The conference room grew quiet as Marcus showed headlines from other cities adopting the Millbrook approach. Small towns police reform goes national. Former problem officers now lead change. Millbrook model shows path to police reform. In the back of the room sat Sarah and Maya, now proud Millbrook residents. Maya had started a high school program connecting teens with police officers, breaking down barriers before they could form. Sarah's school had become a model for community police partnerships. 2 years ago, Marcus continued, 3 officers thought it was funny to tie up a black man. Today, those same officers are teaching departments across America how to build trust instead of fear. He invited Jenkins, Miller, and Brooks to join him on stage. The audience stood and applauded, not just for their transformation, but for the hope they represented. Change isn't just about new rules or better training, Marcus concluded. It's about changing hearts. It's about turning enemies into allies. It's about believing that people can be better than their worst moments. After the speech, police chiefs lined up to schedule visits to Millbrook. Reporters gathered around the 3 officers, asking how they had changed so completely. Chief Thompson could have destroyed us, Jenkins explained. Instead, he showed us a better way. Miller added, we thought we were just changing ourselves. Turns out we were changing policing. Brooks smiled at a group of young officers. Now we get to help others change too. That evening, as Marcus packed up his presentation, he found a note on his podium. It was from the son of the older black officer who had given him a chance 25 years ago. Dad would be proud. You didn't just change 3 officers or 1 department. You're changing the future of policing. Marcus carefully folded the note and put it in his wallet. On his phone, he saw messages from Millbrook. The community garden was blooming, the youth program was expanding, and 3 more departments had signed up for training. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best changes. A zip tie incident meant to humiliate had instead sparked a movement. And it all started with a choice, not to punish, but to transform. The Millbrook model wasn't just about police reform anymore. It was about believing in the power of change, 1 person, 1 department, 1 community at a time.